So we talk a lot about church unity. I preach on church unity sometimes. And that's because church unity is a big deal, right? So let me ask you something. Rhetorical question. Just a reminder, that means you don't answer out loud, all right? Rhetorical question. The way you treat others in this church and talk about others in this church, is our church Exhibit A, or is our church something the demons can mock? All right, let's go on. That question was painful enough, wasn't it? Okay, so now he says here, he says that the church, the unity of the church in Christ, bringing them together. He says this has been God's eternal purpose, to save us, to unite us in Christ, and to demonstrate his wisdom by sending Christ. And because we are God's eternal purpose, accomplished in and through Christ, Paul says we can approach God with freedom and confidence. Now, we see this idea all the time in sports, right? Do you think Tom Brady is afraid to go and talk to the front office of the Buccaneers and tell them what he wants? No, not at all. Why? Because Tom is that important of a player and that important to the organization. Now, I am not saying that I am important because of who I am, but I am saying that we are important because of who we are in Christ and the purpose God has for us. And so it says we can approach God with confidence, in freedom. And usually we think that that's talking about prayer, that we can approach God in prayer, but it means much more than that, much more. It's talking about pressing into God and fellowshipping with God and living in the presence of God. It's the opposite of pulling back or away from God. This is understanding that in Christ, God's scepter is always extended to us. What does that mean? Think Esther. Okay, you're invited in. Book of Esther, the king had to extend the scepter in order for Esther to come in and make her request. Okay, so God's scepter is always extended to us. We can always come into his presence. His arms are always open to us. He loves us. He enjoys us. He delights in us. He wants to walk with us. It's the difference between seeing God as a distant God waiting for us to mess up and seeing God as our Abba Father who loves us and has our picture in his wallet. Right? And then we're just going to wrap up with verse 13 tonight. Verse 13 says, I ask you therefore not to be discouraged because of my sufferings for you, which are your glory. So Paul tells the Ephesian Christians, because of verses 2 through 12, do not be discouraged by my sufferings. How do you see verses 2 through 12 changing the Ephesian Christians' perspective so that they're not discouraged by Paul's sufferings? He's in prison. He's in prison for the gospel. So everything that we've kind of talked about in verses 2 through 12, how does that change the Ephesian Christians' perspective so that they're not discouraged in what they're hearing about Paul's predicament? Well, it's kind of what some of you alluded to a little bit earlier. God's glorious and eternal purpose was accomplished through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So suffering, persecution, even death does not mean defeat or the abandonment of God. Okay?